Good morning and welcome to this informational webinar on the updated policy guidance for Bulletin 1903, which is Louisiana's handbook for students with dyslexia. My name is Dr. Lisa Holliday. I am the supervisor of literacy professional development for the department, and I will also serve as your contact for Bulletin 1903. I will preface this conversation by saying I do not consider myself an expert on dyslexia, but I can use my understanding and insight into the development of this updated policy to be a support to you with its implementation. So again, you are welcome to drop any questions you have in the chat box. I won't have an opportunity to look at those until after the presentation, so I do hope to answer most of your questions throughout the presentation. We did try to build in responses to questions we've already received since this revision process has started. So any questions we are not able to get to today, we will put into a follow-up frequently asked questions document that will be posted for everyone on the website. Today, we will take some time to just review the background information about how these updates to the dyslexia policy came about. We will share some of the major issues that were addressed by a work group of diverse stakeholders. Then we will dig into the criteria outlined in the policy regarding the screening processes. We will also go through the steps to effectively implement the policy, including the referral process, how students qualify for additional support and services, and effective ways to track progress. So let's start with some background information about the process that was used to make these revisions to Bulletin 1903. The definition of dyslexia that is adopted by Louisiana was updated in 2020 through the passage of Act 206. So the new definition defines dyslexia as an unexpected difficulty in reading for an individual who has the intelligence to be a much better reader, most commonly caused by a difficulty in phonological processing, which affects the ability of an individual to speak, read, and spell. And then it further defines phonological processing as the appreciation of the individual sounds of spoken and written language. In response to the updated definition of dyslexia, along with support from current research on the science of teaching reading, a work group was formed to review and revise Bulletin 1903, which had not been updated in over 20 years. The work group was made up of stakeholders from a variety of organizations in the fields of education, science, psychology, and advocacy. The recommendations from the work group were endorsed by the Early Literacy Commission, the Special Education Committee, and approved by Bessie. The work of the group was grounded in a shared vision to support our state's struggling students to become better readers and feel successful in their school experiences. Louisiana believes that all students, including those with dyslexia and related disorders, should have the opportunities to meet challenging objectives. As the work group began sifting through the previous policy and prioritizing revisions, some central themes began to emerge in the discussions. They agreed that policy guidance should be easily accessible and usable for teachers and school leaders, something they could pick up and use without having to decipher too much legal jargon or technical language. They wanted to make sure that the end result was streamlined and focused on what it was meant to accomplish, which is providing guidance on identifying and effectively supporting students at risk of dyslexia. As they worked through current research, build expertise, and lessons learned from experiences with the previous policy, it became a priority to clarify the screening process to ensure that it utilized resources available to school systems that support best practices without requiring the purchasing of a lot more materials. The gated screening process that is used in the revised policy provides a framework defined by developmentally appropriate expectations that ensure that students with various individual needs are supported and instructed in their specific areas of deficit to improve their overall outcomes. So at the center of all of this is that individualized approach of addressing student needs. The work group made the following revisions to the policy. The characteristics of dyslexia were updated based on current research and input from experts in the field. The work group referenced many resources, including other states' guidance on this subject, and found that the inclusion of grade level appropriateness helped to streamline the process for screening, identification, and providing support to students at risk for dyslexia. Some of the chapters were reordered to better reflect the processes of screening, identifying, and supporting students with characteristics of dyslexia. This restructuring will provide clearer guidance for teachers and school leaders as well. The contributing factors list was addressed in other ways in other areas of the policy, such as the data collection section. So a lot of the repetitive language was removed as well. The work group found that the list of ADHD and social emotional risk factors felt a little out of place in this bulletin, because this bulletin was intended to clearly address the needs of students at risk for dyslexia, and those other disorders were not otherwise addressed in the law that this policy addresses. So other types of screenings that address those areas, as well as those timelines, are outlined in other policies. The stipulations on grades and minute requirements were also removed because different students have different needs. And we know that grades alone are not an appropriate indicator of specific student needs. So we really want the student needs to drive the decisions through this process. In addition to those revisions, the work group addressed a few other issues in the policy updates. One area that was discussed was funding. School systems should be able to determine the needs of their staff and students based on these policy guidelines, and also use screeners and data-based resources that align to the criteria outlined in the revised policy. We also know that with some of the recent literacy legislation that has been passed, there will be additional funding opportunities for literacy-based activities, screeners, and trainings. Specific timelines that were outlined in the previous policy were streamlined to ensure that student needs is the focus on developing the timelines of support, progress monitoring, and additional services. The extensive and repetitive references to laws that were in the previous policy were reduced to authority notes, which is outlined in current policy writing practices. The information within the policy was also streamlined, removing some of that repetitive language and any unaddressed references to other requirements that were not explicitly addressed in this policy. So the overall consensus was that the purpose of this policy was to effectively implement Louisiana's dyslexia law, and therefore the contents of the policy should focus on making that explicit and user-friendly. Now let's get into the details of the screening processes in the updated policy. First of all, there is a document on the department's website entitled A Guide to Dyslexia in Louisiana. That document has been updated to reflect the current policy. I would like to note here that as of today, the link for Bulletin 1903 has not been updated on the BESI policy website. So the link that is currently embedded in the guidance document here is a link to the June legislative register, in which the revised policy is listed among all the other policies that were changed. So that link will be updated within that document as soon as the new policy link is available on the BESI website. And that the guide and other dyslexia resources are currently housed in the academics library. There's a download box specifically for dyslexia about midway down. So again, this presentation will be provided to you on the website. And we will also put it in the weekly newsletter next week, so you have that link to it and all of the other resources so that you can access all of these. As we all know, students in kindergarten through third grade are currently required to be screened on basic literacy skills within the first 30 days of school. The revisions in Bulletin 1903 support that requirement and provide some additional areas to screen when concerns become apparent for potential struggling readers. Those additional screenings are not required for all students. They are there if you need them. On the next few slides, we will go over the required screenings, which are also listed in Bulletin 1903 as kind of the step 1 gate, and the additional screening options for students at risk for dyslexia. All right, so in kindergarten, during the kindergarten school year, all students are screened for phonemic awareness, letter naming fluency, letter sound recognition. So that is the components that all students can be screened for. I'm just going to take this by grade level. And then the additional screenings that are listed in Bulletin 1903 are for students if they show a deficit in any of those areas. So we'll say some of this guidance will align much, I think, maybe better to the upcoming development of or selection of the universal screening in that process. So that is the purpose, is to kind of align all of these processes. So right now, with the current procedures in place for this school year being the same options as we've had before, what I'll say is these required screenings are the ones you start with. So this is your starting point. If you suspect that a child may have dyslexia or a related disorder, you want to start here with these screening pieces. And then if they do show a deficit in one of those areas, then you go on to these. And you do not have to do all of these. It would not make sense to screen a child in rapid automatic naming skills if they did fantastic on letter naming, which is an rapid automatic skill. So you're really going to let the student data guide your decisions here. And this would be something you discuss with your SBLC team and other leaders on your campus. So this is just your guidelines for those conversations. So if a student shows deficits on any of the previous screening instruments, these are some areas you can go to next. They may need to be screened further in phonological awareness, which would include rhyming and syllable manipulation, or they may need rapid automatic naming skills, and you would kind of scale back to colors, objects, and numbers. So this is kind of a scaling back from the previous screeners. And again, you may need to do one or more than one of these. In first grade, all students can be screened in the fall semester. It falls to phonemic awareness, letter naming fluency, and letter sound recognition. And then in the spring semester, we move into decoding and oral reading fluency. And then if a student shows a deficit in any of those previous areas, then you would go on to these additional screening options. Depending on where they showed their deficit, will guide you to where you need to start with additional screenings. And again, that's definitely a student by student basis. You would want to talk to your SBLC team about if you have any questions on where to go next. So some areas you could go to in the fall semester when they're, based on the skills that are appropriate at that time, you would want to screen additionally in phonological awareness and rapid automatic naming skills in that first part of first grade. And then in the spring, second semester, you could move into phonological and phonemic awareness, including syllable and phoneme manipulation, additional rapid automatic naming skills, and encoding skills and oral written language skills. For second and third grade, we already screen decoding and oral reading fluency. Now, there has been some questions brought up here, so I do want to just clarify that screening for second and third grade students can begin with real words. Nonsense words is listed in Bulletin 1903, but that's more of a scaffold back. So you're going to continue to do your decoding and oral reading fluency. That is typical of the required screenings for second and third grade. And then if you need to scaffold back to nonsense words, that would be if deficits are evident, you would want to scaffold back and do that further screening to make a determination of if support is necessary or if additional screening is necessary. And the additional screening areas for second and third grade include, you can go all the way back to phonological and phonemic awareness, depending on where they show deficits. You may need to go all the way back to rapid automatic naming skills, encoding skills, which is like spelling and writing, and oral and written language skills. So those are some areas you can screen further in 2nd and 3rd grades, again, based on your student data. Some important notes to keep in mind as you're going through this process and thinking through how to best approach it. A student demonstrating deficits after additional screening is considered to have characteristics of dyslexia and should be provided interventions and structured language and multisensory structured language and literacy interventions. So again, that's if they have shown deficits in both areas, the required screening that you're doing anyway, and the additional screening areas. Just as a side note for anyone outside of the K2 or K3 world, screening is not limited to students in kindergarten through 3rd grade. It can be administered at any grade level at any time. And if a student exhibits impediments to a successful school experience. So even if you've got an older student who is showing weaknesses, you can go back and screen them as well. You will also notice that the lengthy list of screening instruments and assessments was removed from the policy. This was done because there would need to be frequent changes made to the policy, and that requires the whole BESI process as research and new screeners are continually developed and adjusted. So it is also no longer best practices in policy writing to include such lengthy list within policies. So the structure of Bulletin 1903 now includes a clear set of criteria that screening instruments should assess. So you've got all those specific areas that can be assessed, and that can help you select a screening instrument that is most appropriate. The department does provide a list of some approved instruments in their supporting early learning and literacy guide. But again, educators really should follow the criteria outlined in the policy to guide their selection of appropriate screening instruments. All right, let's talk through some of the additional application steps in the implementation of the policy. So once you've done your screenings and such, we understand those. Let's go to the actual process. So just for clarity, this is kind of a basic version of the referral process outlined for SBLC. So step 1, if a student is identified as having possible characteristics of dyslexia, that can be through concerns or expressed from a parent or guardian, an educator or an advocate, or screening data that has already been collected. So step 2, that student should be referred to SBLC. Next step, SBLC works on collecting more data, including additional screening and intervention implementation data. So that's an important piece. Intervention should start as soon as you notice a child needs it. You can do interventions at any point with a student. So if you have a student who is struggling, help them. And then step 4, SBLC determines if a referral to Section 504 committee or the pupil appraisal team for special education evaluation is appropriate. So it could, depending on the results of the data, you would determine which way to go from there. To be even clearer, a student may qualify for additional support or services if they have consistently demonstrated difficulty despite receiving instruction in a high-quality curriculum with the implementation of additional instructional intervention strategies within the framework of a multi-tiered system of support. We cannot stress that important piece enough. These are students who struggle. The students that should be identified through this process are ones who are receiving that explicit systematic instruction. They have received interventions, you have tried to support them, and they are still struggling. So that's an area that as school leaders, especially, we need to make sure is happening, that these students are being identified after all of these supports have been in place. If a student shows deficits on the required screening, as well as the additional screening outlined in the policy, they can be considered to be at risk for having characteristics of dyslexia. In such cases, they should be provided additional support through interventions and a multisensory structured language and literacy intervention program. So what does that mean? The multisensory structured language and literacy program should do the following. They should have instruction in phonological awareness, phoneme-grapheme association, phonics, syllables, linguistics, meaning, and reading fluency. Now, again, the program may contain all those areas, but you're going to provide instruction where the child needs it. So we don't need to continue instructing a child on syllables if they've got that part mastered. You're going to focus on the areas where they show the deficit and where they need support. The program should also integrate all aspects of language-based instruction, including receptive, expressive, oral and written language, and handwriting. It should use instructional methods that are explicit, systematic, sequential, cumulative, individualized, diagnostic, demonstrate automaticity of performance, simultaneously multisensory, and follow the synthetic to analytics phonics instruction process. Now, that's a lot of big words. They are all defined in the policy. So if you're not familiar with those, or if you just need, I have to look at them myself to make sure I have a full, complete understanding of what we're working on. They are defined in the policy. And the program should also allow for adequate practice opportunities to develop automaticity of performance. So students should be able to do these skills automatic without having to stop and pause and think about what they're doing. That's when they truly show mastery. And that means a lot of repeated turns, which is good practice. Continually tracking a student's progress is an integral part of this process. Progress monitoring data should be regularly collected to determine the effectiveness of interventions and support programs being used. Again, the department offers additional resources to support schools and systems with implementing this policy and providing the best support for our students. In addition to these resources, the frequently asked questions document will be updated soon to reflect the recent questions and clarifications that have been requested. So there is a frequently asked questions document currently in the academics library under, along with the guide, under additional disability related resources for dyslexia. That document will be updated to reflect questions from parents as well as educators. And this slide deck will also be posted in that same library along with the other dyslexia guidance documents. We also have the literacy library, which has a ton of resources and tools, as well as professional development available for teachers and leaders and families. And that is in our literacy library. We've just completed 2 professional development series, one for teachers on the science of reading and one for leaders on the implementation of that. So those would be extremely helpful in your understanding of how to best implement these supports and resources for struggling readers. So please check those out as well. I know there's probably some questions in the chat box, so I will take a look at that in just a moment. But if you have any other questions, or if you think of something after the fact or throughout this school year, if you come across things, please don't hesitate to reach out. We are here to support you. You can email louisianaliteracy@la.gov, or you can email me directly, lisa.holiday, 2 L's, @la.gov with any questions that you have. So I know that was a very quick, loaded overview, but I want to thank you all for taking time to join us today. I'm going to stop here and address any questions in the chat box. And if you have anything else, just let me know. Otherwise, thank you for your time today. I hope it was useful and helpful, and I appreciate you very much. Y'all have a wonderful school year. I know it's starting off kind of crazy again, but our educators are the strongest and the best. So we're gonna be great. Thank y'all so much.